thank you very much for having me here with you. I have to confess that it was absolutely the persuasive powers of the students of IIT Mumbai that have me here, particularly Deepak, who made sure that he could argue against every excuse that I gave to make sure that to win me over and to have me here. But I'm delighted to be here, and I was delighted to hear about your institute as well. I thought I would sort of take you through some of the challenges as we see them, and I will look forward to an interaction with all of you as well, because I'm sure there will be questions about how do we move ahead, and I think that's the big challenge that we have today. I think one of the biggest issues that faces us as environmentalists is there is an enormous paradox that we see in the world today. I began work in 1980 when environment was something that wasn't even talked about. You know, nobody really understood what it was. Today, everybody talks about being green. From every film star to every businessman, everybody talks about green. And I think in terms of general consciousness, I believe the environmental consciousness has grown by leaps over the last 20, 30 years. We understand the importance of it, we understand what it means. We are believers in this cause. That's a phenomenon world over. But on the other hand, the paradox is that even as we become more and more interested and aware of the environmental concerns, we seem to be losing every battle of environment that stares us in the face. Our cities are getting more polluted by the day. The air of Mumbai is as foul as the air of Delhi, I can assure you. The only thing is that you have the advantage of the sea that takes away the dirt, the toxins that exist in the air. Our rivers today have been murdered brutally. More and more our rivers are polluted. And if you look at the entire world, the world is losing what I think is one of the biggest existential battles that it has, the battle against climate change. And this is when we know that climate change is a threat, we know it is urgent, and we also know that it is a phenomenon that will take away the gains of development. If you look at climate change, we know today that extreme events are growing, both in intensity and ferocity. We know that the poor in the world are the most vulnerable. And in India, the impacts of climate change will be seen most of all through the variability, increased variability of our monsoons. Now, we also know very clearly that the gentleman who sits as the Finance Minister of India, Mr. Chidambaram, is not really the Finance Minister of India. The monsoons are the Finance Minister of India. They determine the livelihood, the economies of vast numbers of people. They're also a very capricious phenomena. They confound science. We do not understand them. And yet, what we know today is that what will happen with climate change is that this extremely capricious phenomena will become even more variable, even more extreme. We have very limited number of rainy days in India, and yet what scientists, what emerging science seems to suggest is that those days will become even fewer. So we will have more rain, but in fewer number of rainy days, which means extreme weather events, it means extreme rainfall events, it means more floods, more droughts. And this is when we know that therefore one of the biggest challenges that faces us is to get growth right. If you look at climate change itself, we know that climate change, as I said earlier, will make our world more vulnerable, will make our world more vulnerable in terms of extreme weather events. And yet we know today that we ourselves are getting all our water management so wrong that we are in any case making us more vulnerable to floods and to droughts. If you look at cities, if you look at Mumbai, one of the biggest reasons for the flood that happened in Mumbai a few years ago was not just the fact that you saw such severe rainfall, but it was also the fact that the city has completely, deliberately destroyed its drainage systems. It has never planned for rain. It has never planned to get rid of the excess of rain, which is what is happening in the floodplains of Bihar, where we thought that we could embank the rivers, we could train our rivers, and yet we find today that the rivers actually flow higher than even the embankment. And any breach in the embankment means that the water has nowhere to go, because we destroyed the entire system of flood management, which was built on ponds and tanks and channelizing water so that you could use water both in its excess as well as in its scarcity. So on one hand, we have used modern technology, modern knowledge, modern engineering science to reconfigure nature in ways that we thought we could do so. And we have not got it right. On the other hand, we today have the impact of our own growth, of that economic growth that we are all addicted to, and we have no other way out of it. That growth itself is now leading to changes which will make our world even more vulnerable. And so we have to do everything in sort of record time. But the other is the challenge of reinventing growth as we know it. The fact is, the world today is losing the battle of climate change, and I believe is also losing the environmental battle, because we are trying to find small solutions to what is clearly a large problem and requires us to rethink our approaches. We know today that climate change is linked to economic growth as we know it. We also know that the world has not reinvented growth without pollution as yet. There is no part of the world that can tell you that they have found answers to the problems of environmental degradation or climate change. Every one of the richest nations of the world is in fact losing this battle. And this is because current technology, in my view, offers half-baked solutions and not the big answers we are looking for. As I said, climate change is linked to economic growth. The facts speak very clearly. We know that the emissions that come from these sectors that are fueling economic growth are what lead to climate change. We also know that countries have really not been able to reduce their emissions. If you look at this chart is only of the rich countries of the world who took on emission reduction targets under the Kyoto Protocol and said that they would reduce their emissions below 1990 levels. Now, if you look at the blue line, it looks as if those emissions have actually been reduced, but they haven't. Because the emissions that have been reduced are of the countries which are the countries under transition. The erstwhile Soviet Union economies, where economies collapsed, and as a result of it, their emissions collapsed. But the rich country emissions have actually increased over the last 20-30 years. Countries like Canada, countries like Australia, countries like the United States have seen obscene increase in their emissions. So let us be very, very clear that very few countries in the world have actually found us the answers that we are looking for. And the only countries which have reduced their emissions, to some extent Germany, to some extent UK, to some extent Luxembourg, Sweden, they've all done so because of variety of reasons, but none of them you can say are game changers. None of those reasons are reasons in which they have actually transformed their energy economies and yet seen that they can grow. And this is when we also know that when we look at this issue, that there is a double challenge. Not only has the world to reduce its emissions, but the world also has to share the ecological ecological space because the common atmospheric space is one. If you look at this chart, it tells you that if you look at from 1950 to 2000, a single country, United States, has occupied 28% of the global atmospheric space as far as carbon dioxide emissions are concerned. That's the cumulative emissions just in this period. Now just think of large countries with very small populations. If that's the kind of impact that they have, what happens when there are countries like India which now need the space to grow? And that's the big challenge today of the current economic growth model that we have. A growth model which is both creating a crisis for the poorer countries, but also creates a big question in terms of how do you share that same growth across countries, across people, because today the world has literally run out of time and space. And this is where I want you to think a little bit, because when we say this, there are a lot of glib answers I keep getting. I keep getting answers to say, no, don't worry, we have technology solutions and they will find answers, we will find answers. I'm also told there are win-win solutions. And we're always being told that there will be some way in which the world will crawl out of the crisis that we have. And yet, in the organization I work in at CSC, we have done a very detailed analysis of all the economic sectors of India, all the way from energy to steel to aluminium to fertilizer, to look at what would be the low carbon growth trajectory of these sectors. And what becomes very clear is that in the current growth model, there is a technology emission barrier. So you can reduce your emissions to a certain extent, but it is a certain extent only. There is a barrier in the current models of growth that we have. And which is why in the rich world, with all the investment that they can make, they have invested in efficiency. They have invested in environmentally friendly production technologies. And yet they find that even as they have invested, they have not been able to lick the problem that we have. Their emissions continue to grow. And this is when their populations are more or less stagnant. This is when countries like China today are manufacturing most of the production, most of the consumption of the rich countries. And even then you're not seeing stabilization of emissions, you are seeing increase. And this is when India is on the same pathway, but we have a major difference. We need growth for very large numbers, and we have to be very clear, our cost of energy is already very high. We do not have the luxury of cheap energy which fueled growth at a particular time. And we do not need to be preached about the fact that energy cost will increase. Our cost of energy you can ask any industry today, you can ask any household today, poor or rich. The cost of energy, whether it is a poor woman who collects firewood and has a massive health cost for the energy that is used to cook food, or the rich, or the relatively rich middle class, which has to pay electricity bills and does not get energy and so has to use dirty, polluting diesel. Or if you look at industry, our cost of energy is high. We have some senseless and completely mindless policies like diesel for cars, which I think needs to definitely change in this country. And but on the whole, we have our cost of energy is already high, which means we have absolutely no option but to rethink and to reinvent. Even if the rest of the world has found that they can tinker around with small solutions, we have no options but to find big solutions, because we have the additional challenge of having large numbers of people and knowing that our cost of growth is already high. If you look at this chart, which was done by McKinsey, it's probably the only chart of McKinsey I have ever used or will ever use. But I definitely find it very interesting because it tells you this is where, if you look at this part of the chart, it's the chart which has the cheap options, the negative options, the negative price options, which is where countries have invested. So whether it's been motor systems efficiency, whether it's been clinker substitution by fly ash in cement companies, which is being done widely even in India, whether it has been small hydro, these are all whether it's been switched to LED lamps, these are the efficiency-oriented solutions which the world is still investing in. And yet, those are the solutions that the world needs to move to. And even those solutions are already limited. If you look at CCS, which is the golden, which is seen as the silver bullet, that you could actually keep emitting carbon dioxide, but you could capture it and you could store it deep underground. So you could continue to sin, and somewhere your sins will get forgiven. But if you look at those technologies, they're all up in the air still. There is no real breakthrough that we've had where you have a working model, that those things are working and the cost at which they are affordable by society. And that really is the big challenge across the world. That's where we are situated. Our growth imperative, as I said, is high. We have to increase. Our per capita use of cement is very low. We know aluminium is very low. Paper is very low. We need growth. There is no doubt in my mind. And yet, if you look at growth and you look at emissions, this was a chart we looked at where we looked at business as usual, and we factored in all the low-cost technology, the low-carbon technologies that are currently either being used or even being discussed in terms of their theoretical possibilities globally. And we looked at them to say that if India has to grow, and even if India has to use what we are calling today the low-carbon growth strategies, you will find that our emissions will grow. And the difference between the business as usual as well as the low carbon actually reduces over the years. Simply because you find that there are no options that exist, no big options that exist that can let us grow economically and yet find the kind of solutions that we require to reduce our emissions. So we need solutions, environmental solutions, which have new ideas and new technology approaches. And for this you need to accept two truths. One, that most countries in the world, including India, remain behind the environmental problem. And that even if the rich can invest in mitigation of adverse environmental impact, it is only to a limited extent. That current technologies and current growth is putting the world at risk. I'll give you my most favorite example to illustrate this. I don't know if many of you have lived in Delhi. You're too young to have lived in Delhi in the mid-90s, but in the mid-90s, suddenly we grew up, we found in Delhi that the air was just so foul that we just could not even breathe, we could not even see anything. And that's when we learned, and we were already behind the curve, we learned SPM, suspended particulate matter. That's what our emission standards were set for. Yet if you look at the world, it was in 1980 that they had SPM standards that were set for suspended particulate matter. And as scientists discovered that SPM was hazardous to health, technology kicked in, you got better technologies, you got better fuel standards, and we thought we had cleaned up the problem. Yet as we monitored more, we found that it wasn't really SPM that we should worry about. That this new generation of technology that we have has created, in fact, a more serious problem of particulate matter, which is so small, 2.5. We started off at 10, PM10, quickly moved to PM2.5. help, because science discovered that the human body had never been made by God for diesel engines. And so the nose, hair in your nose can keep out the rougher particulate matter, but they cannot keep out the particulate matter that comes out of diesel engines. And so you invested further in clean fuel, you invested in vehicle technology, you invested also in monitoring the impacts of that vehicle technology, and you essentially found that yes, you had managed to control in the atmosphere, in the richer countries, you managed to control a suspended particulate which was dangerous to health. But that same technology which was used to control suspended particulate matter had created another problem of NOx. Because as you used higher temperatures for burning, you had another problem of NOx, and so you had to come in with new emission standards which now control NOx emissions, which is what Europe is today doing with DeNOx catalysts in its vehicles. And in all this, as we are discovering all this, there is now a new range of particulates that are being discussed, which are nanoparticles, which will now not just go through your nose, but will also go through your skin. So the point in all this is that as we innovate in this model to improve our technologies, to find solutions to the problems that we think we have on hand, we create new problems. And in all this, transport-related emissions are today the fastest growing emissions as far as climate change is concerned. And yet, given our obsession with finding technological problems to the problem of vehicle technology and emissions, we have never looked at the fact that perhaps it is not the after-treatment device that we put into a vehicle. It is not the fact that we move to a hybrid vehicle which is cleaner fuel, but we actually get rid of the car completely and replace it with a bus. That we think about reinventing mobility. We think about the problem differently so that we are not looking at it from a point of view of each problem and finding a solution, but finding a solution to the larger problem of mobility, getting people from one place to another. That doesn't require just the car. It requires an efficient solution. It requires a solution that moves society towards sufficiency as well. And it is that kind of solution that we will need. In the city I work in, Delhi, we are struggling very hard with what we are calling the second generation reform for clean air. So the first generation reform was to bring in compressed natural gas, which we pushed very hard for. And we pushed for CNG not because it was a cute idea, but because it essentially was a leapfrog idea. It gave us emissions which were lower than what even existed in Europe at that time. It gave us a 10-year advantage. So you looked for a solution which was a big leapfrog idea. But even as we have introduced CNG, we are finding that the numbers of vehicles, even as they have become cleaner in every generation, the sheer numbers of vehicles or the sheer number of diesel vehicles, and remember, anything any industry tells you that they are making clean diesel vehicles, it's a joke. It's a joke on the planet. So I will add to Tarun's list that if you're serious about this, then please don't drive an SUV and don't drive a diesel vehicle. Because if you're really serious about environment, that's where it really hits. But today in Delhi, we are finding that everything we've done, the air is getting more foul. And so we need to invest in a new generation of solutions, and those solutions will lie in actually reinventing mobility. Because still only 13% of Delhi actually drives. Only 13%. And yet 26% of Delhi's roads are already congested. We are already polluted. So you need a solution which is equitable, where everybody can drive, is road space for all. And that's the kind of approach that we will need. So we need answers to affordable growth that is sustainable, and we need to make sure that we can find those leapfrog solutions, because countries that have found answers to environment have done so only, as I said, as they became rich and were drowning in waste, and they're small answers. Let me give you my favorite example very quickly. It's an example that I've just spent 2 years looking at, which is the problem of shit in our cities, excreta. It's something that we never talk about. It's something that we never think about. But it's something that we need to address. And we need to think about it in terms of why are we failing so much. We know that we have a large pollution control program. Every city has a program. Every government has a program to clean its rivers. And yet we know that every one of those programs has focused on sewage treatment plants, which are essentially hardware-oriented solutions, but they have worked everywhere else. So I don't blame any Indian technologist, civil engineer to think that if there is a problem of pollution, then the answer is sewage treatment plants. Because that's what was done, whether it's the Hudson or the Thames or any other river of the world. And that's what we can think we can do to clean up the Mithi or the Yamuna or the Ganga or the Kaveri or whatever other river that we have. And yet we are finding that we build the sewage treatment plants, and yet the rivers are full of sewage. And there is in fact a linear relationship between the amount of investment we are making and the pollution in our rivers. So the question is why? And when we looked at this, and I actually did, my colleagues and I spent a lot of effort. We pulled out information from 71 different cities, looked at 2 essential questions, which I hope all of you will start asking as obsessively as I do. Wherever I go, I have only 2 questions to ask. Where does your water come from? Where does your shit go? Begin to ask that and you will find fascinating answers. You will begin to find just how societies build cities without thinking of their capacity to pay for the technologies that are needed to run the cities even. And I think that's really where I certainly found that we needed to join the dots of what I call the pollution society equity dilemma. The pollution control programs do not link today the political economy of water supply, which is that the longer the distance of water coming to cities, the higher the cost of water, the higher the cost of energy, the higher the distribution losses. And if you have these large systems bringing in water, you spend all your money in just supply of water, even that you cannot do. And so you have absolutely no money to spend in sewage. And remember, 80% of whatever comes to your house as water, 80% of that leaves it as sewage. So if you look at this city of Mumbai, it has the most mindless way of getting its water, the longer distances, fighting with irrigation, with farmers, to basically pipe its water long distances. It's not just Mumbai, it's every city that we are finding. But the second part of it is the political economy of defecation. So there is a political economy of water, but there is also the political economy of defecation. Most Indian cities, including the richest city, how many of you come from Bangalore? Bangalore, okay. It's a very techno, high-tech city, okay? It's one of the cities that you would think certainly had it right in terms of its sewage technologies. And yet, even if you look at Bangalore, most of the city has not got underground sewage. So it has 17 or 14 sewage treatment plants, but the sewage never reaches its sewage treatment plants for treatment. We forget the fact that we are a poor country. We have not got that infrastructure so that we cannot connect all our individual households to an underground drainage, to a sewage treatment plant, and therefore, at the end of it, we will end up polluting. So if you look at this, very quickly, every city has been mapped out where they're getting their water from, their traditional sources, and their current sources, and their future sources. And in every city, you will see the arm, the length of the arm. It's almost like, a parasite. The city is getting longer and longer to pull its water to the city. And as I said, the cost of energy in water supply is growing. It's a growing component of your water supply in every city. And cities do not have drains. You have new growth cities that are growing without drain. You have a backlog and frontlog, which is impossible to fix. So if you look at just the 71 cities we put together, only 4 cities claimed that they had over 70% underground sewage. Chennai, Pune, Surat, and Gurgaon. And Gurgaon you can cross off the list because it's only talking about municipal Gurgaon, where we know the sewage system doesn't work. And the new growth Gurgaon doesn't even have the beginning of a semblance of an underground sewage system. If you look at Mumbai, it's less than 50% underground sewage. So you have a huge challenge of fixing or building a capital-intensive system, of investing in it, in making it work, and to keep growing and to make sure that you can keep building that system even as you grow. But the most important part of that challenge is that because the cost of building the systems is high, the cities only build limited amounts. They have limited sewage systems that they can build. So they build for few. In Mumbai, your sewage system works perfectly for South Mumbai. There's no problem there. You will never see or feel or smell sewage in the air. Okay? Because you invest in a system for a limited number of people. But then you spend all your money, and you have very limited money because you have already spent all the money you have in bringing water to people. Very little money now left in municipal accounts to build the pipes, to repair, the energy costs of pumping to the treatment plants. So the municipality, the city, the state can only end up servicing the needs of very few. But because it cannot service the needs of large numbers, their waste has to go somewhere. We forget the fact that if there is any human being, there will be excreta. And if there is excreta, it will need to be collected, intercepted, treated before it is disposed of. And because we cannot do that, we spend so much on treating the excreta of few, we have a huge pollution problem because the treated excreta of a few gets mixed with the untreated excreta of the majority. And as a result of it, we in India are a generation of lost rivers. I cannot think of any more tragic development for any society which loses something like a river. My own city of Delhi had a river called the Sahibi River, which is today called the Najafgarh Drain. And it is only a drain. The Mithi from the Powai Dam, from the Powai Lake here, was a living, flowing river 60 years ago. It was an important source of fresh water flow. And today, in the official records of the Mumbai municipality, it is called a drain. Ludhiana, the Buddha Nala, was a darya. Today, it is called a drain because it has nothing more than the human excreta and the chemical waste of the industries. So we are a generation that is losing its rivers. But as I said, if you want to fix it, you will have to think differently. Because if anyone tells you that this problem will be fixed as we get richer, as the infrastructure kicks in, as more investment comes in, then be very clear that they don't know what they are talking about. Because we know today that the water, sewage, pollution costs are high, and they are unaffordable by all. Even the richest Indians if you were to start costing the cost of water as it exists today and the sewage treatment system as it exists today and factor in all the costs, even the richest Indians can't pay for it. I'm not talking about the very obscene rich Indians. I'm talking about the majority of what you would call middle class Indians. So you have to reinvent the way we supply water. You have to cut the cost. You have to make water supply more efficient. You have to depend on local water harvesting. You have to find ways in which the length of the pipeline can be reduced, how you can make water supply more efficient at the household level. You have to think about how you can recycle and reuse every drop of water even before it gets generated. But if you're thinking about recycle and reuse, then you can't think about transporting water, wastewater long distances. You will have to reinvent the flush toilet. And if you were to think about it in technology terms, and this is a technology that desperately needs reinvention. We have sent a man to the moon, but we have never been able to reinvent the flush toilet. A completely mindless technology if you were to think about it. A little bit of human excreta, which is actually a resource. The flush toilet uses water to flush, to convey, and then to dispose of. It was a technology invented in the cholera infested times of UK and in the US, where water was not so desperately needed. And yet, in our part of the world, where we have a challenge of water, we have a challenge of money, and we have a challenge to reach sanitation to all. And we have a challenge to make sure that that sanitation we reach to all does not destroy our rivers. Then you have to reinvent that technology from an affordability point of view, from a sustainability point of view. Same issues in every field that you could look at. Give you a very quick one again on renewable energy. Everybody talks about renewable energy. And yet, to my mind, the issue is not renewable. It is access to energy for all. Particularly in a country like India, where large numbers of people remain outside the grid, remain in darkness, and we have not been able to find the technology options to be able to get households affordable, reliable sources of energy. So if you were to look at it from an Indian point of view, if you were to look at the renewable question, then would you be actually investing in grid-based, large, solar-based projects, where you have a transmission and distribution system, which in any case leaks? So you have a PLF for 20% in your solar plants, you have a distribution loss of 20%, very expensive energy is being generated, very expensive energy is being lost. Or would you think about creating a solar energy revolution in India, which would think about how you would do it like the cellular or the mobile phone, where you could actually cut the cost of the grid and get distributed energy to large numbers of people. But if you were to do that, you would have to think about a business model where the technology could actually work. Because the current business model only knows large systems, large powerhouses. So the same companies that have been making coal-based power are today in the solar energy business. Because they know that solar energy can be made by making a powerhouse, feeding it into the grid. That's all they know. Yet, what you need is a business unusual model, which will actually be able to take energy to the doorsteps of people, provide a mini grid option that can actually work, where you could bill your customers, where you could find affordable solution, where you could have technicians that can make sure that those mini grids don't fail. You would have to think completely differently, both in terms of the technology, its business model, and its societal goal. And in all this, if you want to do this, then you have to recognize that there is a key difference between what I call the environmentalism of the rich versus the environmentalism of the poor. As I said earlier, the rich countries had created solutions because they had already had a problem and they were looking for answers. But in our part of the world, we have huge numbers of protests happening against projects, what I call the million pollution mutinies. Huge protests happening where the poor are saying that they are poor, but our kind of development will only make them poorer. In some senses, this is an indictment of the development paradigm, but if you were to think about it, it's also it forces us to rethink that development, where we will have to do more with less. Because if you cannot get to all the coal mining and you cannot get to all the bauxite mining, then you will have to think about how you can actually optimize on the resources that you have. And this democracy is actually pushing for change. It's happening across India, across the country, where the poor are essentially saying that our kind of development is destroying their life and their livelihood. And this is really the difference, because environmentalism in the middle class that you and I belong to is growing only as a way to mitigate and contain problems of growth. We are waste managers at best. We will depend on technology fixes. We will look for small solutions. So you will never get rid of plastic. You will just find ways in which you won't use plastics as carrier bags and then eat chips in the same plastic bags. And then find ways of being able to collect it and dispose of it and struggle against the garbage problem that is happening across India. The best thing that is happening with garbage in this country is the fact that villagers are now saying to people in cities that enough is enough. They will not accept our garbage. Whether it is in Kerala, whether it is in Pune, there are villagers who are saying that you can't dump your garbage on our land. This is not in my backyard. Which means that if you would actually look at their kind of environmentalism, you will find the answers that we are looking for. And really, to me, therefore, the answer is that we have to find, as I said, I began off with saying environmental growth, the idea has grown, but the practice has not. And I'm underlining it to all of you to say the practice is difficult because we have to reinvent the models, the approaches, the ideas. We have to find technologies that are affordable and that are workable for large numbers. We need big ticket solutions. So the agenda is threefold. One, the challenge of innovative ideas, technologies which score high on affordability and sustainability, both, not just sustainability, but also affordability. Challenge of scale, being able to take those technologies and implement it at the scale of the transition that is needed, and the challenge of capacity, changing minds. My biggest challenge, my hope will be if all of you stop believing in the sewage treatment plant or will reinvent the sewage treatment plant. And then you will have multipliers in society who will start at least questioning the fact that these are not answers that are for the given. I don't know what the answer is, but unless we start questioning that those answers are not working, we will never even start looking for different solutions. But the way ahead, therefore, is to reinvent that growth, and the only way you can do that is if you deepen democracy, if you were to listen to the people, the environmentalism of the poor that I talked about, give them more rights to be able to say no, then we as a society will also be forced to find the answers, the inventive solutions that we are looking for. One of the reasons why the United States never has to do anything differently to reduce its emissions is because global democracy does not work. But if Indian democracy was to work, then Indian policy will have to find the answers. But all this means that technology has to come with new politics. And that politics is that frugality, is not poverty. If we start understanding this, then I think we will get that new generation of change that we require. Thank you very much.
The audience is required to remain seated in their places. We now invite you to ask some questions if you have any to Ms. Narayan.
Given how dependent we are on like global policies, what policy changes does this redefinition of growth need? Like, if we want to, let's say, make agriculture the thing that we are proud about India, which is not our policy right now. So, what do you think? Like, we are dependent on what the world does today. So, how do you think? What policy changes do you think are needed for that?
That's a very good question. I think the only, we are always dependent on what the rest of the world does because we have a mindset that believes that they have fixed it and we will also fix it. And we always remain behind the problem because we accept that as the only solution. What I'm asking you to first do is to start understanding that those solutions don't exist. That those solutions are half-baked. That those solutions don't work from a point of view of either sustainability or equity. So one is the mindset, and that's very important. Please understand it is one of the biggest barriers you have to policy. When we were pushing compressed natural gas in Delhi, one of the big challenges we had was everybody said to us, but it's not being done anywhere in the world. Not at the scale that you are requiring it. At that time, LA was the only city which had some CNG, but it had limited CNG. Some 80 buses ran on gas. And here we were talking about taking the entire city transport and moving it to gas. And there was this whole issue about, but it's never been done. This is madness. And we were told that the gas would blow up and that, these would become fire engines and that gas was explosive, etc., etc. So the first, I think, most important thing is to understand you will have to reinvent. That's one. Two is deepen every process in which people who are affected by environmental degradation can actually speak out. Because if they who are affected by environmental degradation get greater voice, get a sane policy, then policy will be driven to change. I'll give you a simple example, my favorite example of rivers. Now suppose you were to create a situation in which every city living downstream of the city above, Delhi, below Delhi is Mathura, below Mathura is Agra, for instance. Every city could file a case against the city upstream. Then the one simple policy that would come would be that Delhi would have to take its drinking water from Yamuna after all its sewage disposal points. So if you look at the river that flows through the city, the simple policy would be that you can withdraw water only when the river is leaving your territory, not as it is entering your territory. So you don't drink the shit and the urine of the city above. You drink the shit and urine of your own people. Yeah.
My question is that, we are a common man running in India to earn just 2 meals a day, and he never got a time to think about environment. And what will be the solution, to get aware these people? Everybody, awareness is very important. We talk about waste management. Everybody throws there, and he doesn't think about it. So, what will be the thing? We always talk about technology, but technology is not always the solution. So,
can I be very rude to you?
Yeah.
I don't think it's the poor and the common man or the common woman in India which requires education. I think it's the literate class that you and I belong to. We have this technology mindset that I talked about, which is we can fix it, it's only a matter of time. So we are the ones who keep consuming more and more, believing that someday somebody will take our garbage and somewhere it will go and we don't need to think about it. Okay? The poor already use very little water. They're very well aware of the fact that when they have polluted water, it affects their stomach. Diarrhea today kills the largest number of babies in this country. You cannot be more criminally indicted than that. And yet it is all of us who believe that we can flush and the waste will go somewhere. And we don't think about it. So I think it's really about all of us. And that's really where this challenge of the environmentalists of the poor versus the environmentalists of the richest. The environmentalism of the poor is an arrogant environmentalist model. It's where you and I belong. Where we believe that we have the answers, that we'll be able to find the solutions, that we just have to keep doing what we do and somewhere the problem will go away. The environmentalism of the poor is actually asking us to say, let's rethink. When the tribals of Niyamgiri say, don't mind that bauxite because our God lives there. And all of us think they're illiterate. What do they know about aluminium and bauxite? And how stupid can they be that God lives in the forest? Which God lives in a forest? And if it lives, let's relocate it. It's that we need to understand. That is also forcing us to think that they are thinking about the fact that yes, they're poor. They want electricity. I won't romanticize their life and say that leave them where they are. They want electricity, they want health, they want education. But they're also accepting the fact that we'll all have to tread very lightly on earth. And I think that's really where we need to learn from and build it.
Okay.
Maybe I'll collect some of the questions. I'd love to hear your questions, so I'll collect them and answer them quickly. Yeah.
I just want to hear your take on this nuclear power establishment. We all know that we need to grow, and growth is like at 8% now, and it needs to be at 10% next, and India has to deliver everything. So, like, being an environmentalist, we know that no impact assessment has been done for the Kudinkulam plant or the Jaidapur plant. So, like, how beneficial it would be for India to have such establishment, and should be supported. And there have been protests against it, but government is totally like brutalizing on them. So, what do you say?
You've actually given your answer. I'm not against nuclear power. I mean, I refuse to be against any technology per se. It would be most silly to say that you're against a technology. I think the big issue is, yes, we need energy in India. There is no doubt in my mind. We need energy, and our sources of energy are going to get more and more limited, particularly as we have messed up our gas future by giving it to one family which doesn't seem to find gas anymore. We have a real problem with energy today. And nuclear in that sense is a technology that we need to be open to. But if you want nuclear to succeed, then the role of science as open, transparent institutions which are willing to discuss difficult issues with very common people is going to be very critical. Every time I'm on a TV debate with a nuclear scientist, the attitude is, what do you know? Have you studied physics? I'm like, no, I haven't studied physics, I mean, I obviously am some creature, some critter, which should not understand anything, but I have the right to ask. And the biggest problem with the nuclear establishment in India has been, it has been so close, so unaccountable, so non-transparent, it has never faced a human being. And today, if you're going to be in the civil nuclear energy race, you're going to make plants which are next to my house, I want to know. And you cannot tell me that the fishermen of Kudamkulam are illiterate. The fishermen of Kudamkulam see and read everything as much as everyone else does. If you want to convince them that you have invested in the most secure nuclear plant, then it's your job as scientists to go and explain to them everything that you have done. And explain it and explain it and explain it. And you cannot do that if you have bad environmental impact assessment reports, If you look at the Jetapur report, it is not even worth the paper it is written on. It gets all its facts wrong in terms of the amount of what will be the discharge of water, what will be the temperature of water, which will be discharged from that nuclear plant. So basics are wrong. It was done by NEERI. What does NEERI know about nuclear plants? And even if NEERI doesn't know, make it public, talk about it, ask questions, explain. Science will only succeed if people in India are convinced. And you cannot anymore treat people of India like imbeciles. That is going to be the biggest.
I'm sorry, but due to the time constraint, we'll allow just one more question.
Yeah. Actually, this technology is developing day by day. What would you say about Wi-Fi or any wireless technologies like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, radios and all, affecting on environment or not? The waves are affecting on environment or not?
It's related to the question above. I mean, frankly, all this has got to do with your credibility of your institutions which can do monitoring. You know, we all have come out of a generation where we were told tobacco is good for you. And there were many scientists who argued that tobacco was good for you. Companies argued it. The two battles I have fought has been one battle on diesel, where we had 100 crore case filed against us by a leading automobile manufacturer because we said that diesel was toxic. Okay. Today we know now more and more diesel is a carcinogen, a possible air toxic. Pesticides is an issue on which everybody says that pesticides are actually safe. I have a case filed every day against me from our pesticide industry. So in all that, the wireless technology is coming in where there is absolutely no guarantee that the studies that are being done on mobile technology are being done through credible institutions outside industry. If you had that, you and I would believe very clearly what we are being told. We would know that this technology comes with certain risks, but what are those risks? We would learn to work with them. But we would know there would be a credibility in the science that comes in. If you look at mobile technology, look at the studies that are being done, they're all being funded by the same industry which is going to protect its interests. The same thing comes with GM crops. So if you really want science and if you want India to increase its use of technology, which it must and it should, then you also need equally strong institutions which can do independent scrutiny, independent research, can put that out for discussion in the public. What we have today is an extremely obdurate, fossilized, scientific establishment which refuses to talk to people. And you have a growing private sector industry, private sector technology which is growing, where we have as society increasing distrust about what they are telling us. That is not good. So if you want mobile technology, which is all our need today, if you want to make sure that it can grow, then you need the studies. I need to be told whether that mobile tower on top of a school has the acceptable radiation levels or not. I need to be told what is the distance that needs to be kept. All that needs to be told to us. We are not illiterate people, not even the poor of India.
Thank you, ma'am, for speaking.